How did the CIA use psychics during the Cold War? Yes, my friends, psychic. The Stargate project was very real. Hi everyone, I'm Gabby, also known as Not Gabby B, and today we're going to take a look at the CIA's use of psychics. In the UFO Hunters episode that I covered on my podcast, Mystery of Everything, we ended up doing a USO episode, and we saw, which is an unidentified submerged object, and we saw that a remote viewing psychic viewed something called the Autek base, which was this base that they assumed had a link to a alien connection. You have to listen to the episode, guys. Like, I'm not even joking. Go check out Mystery of Everything. It was a lot. But this guy's specialty was viewing locations and structures and then being able to tell what's inside of these buildings and how the structure is constructed, which would be a very useful skill. It's like X-ray vision without the radiation, I guess. What really gets me though is if someone is capable of not being anywhere near a location, but they can actually see what's inside of buildings, can they just look into random people's houses and be like, ah yes, they keep a secret stash of hentai under their bed? I don't know, it just seems a little bit invasive if they can't just turn it off. But that's not the point of this episode, sorry. Anyway, back to the episode. Hopefully we can all collectively ruminate about the logistics of psychics all together. But before we jump into the heart of Project Stargate, I need to give some background info on psychics historically and everything about psychics that would have laid the groundwork for the frickin' CIA to decide to give it a try. So first off, what exactly counts as a psychic? A psychic, according to the Britannica Dictionary, is a person who has strange mental powers and abilities, such as the ability to predict the future, to know what other people are thinking, or to receive messages from dead people. So let's go over some abilities that count as psychic that have been associated with different people throughout recorded history. First off, we have astral projection, which is when someone is able to separate their consciousness from their body. You see this a lot in those TikTok trends where people talk about waking up when sleeping and just moving away from their bodies. And if you haven't heard of this, then good for you. Your TikTok algorithm is really normal, and that must be so freaking nice. So next up, we have atmokinesis, which is the ability to control the weather. There's automatic writing, which is the ability to draw or write without conscious intent. There is bilocation, which is the ability to be present in two places at the same time. And apparently we saw this a lot with saints. So some saints have experienced bilocation, and some of these are Saint Padre Pio, which was alive in 1887 to 1968. He was seen in the US while he was present in Italy. We also have Saint Martin Porres. He traveled from Peru to France to China and Manila through bilocation. I just don't know where they're getting these sources though, because I have a lot of questions. So John Bishop, he was seen in Spain while also living in Italy. This keeps happening. Are they just like traveling from Italy to different countries and people are like, oh my God, I have questions, okay? So the next ability we have is cryokinesis, which is the ability to control ice or cold. There is energy medicine, which is the ability to heal with spiritual energy. There's curse, which is the ability of someone to wish adversity on someone else and actually make it happen. We have ergokinesis, which is the ability to influence the movement of energy, such as electricity, without direct interaction. And hydrokinesis is basically you control water instead of electricity. There's levitation, which is your ability to float or fly. There's inedia, which is the ability to survive without eating or drinking. There's psychic surgery, which is the ability to remove disease in the body by using an energy incision that immediately heals afterwards. There's pyrokinesis, which is where you control fire. That didn't work. Fire with one's mind. Shape-shifting, you can transform your body into another object. Telekinesis, which is the ability to exert force and influence something without any physical interaction. There's teleportation, and that is the ability to transfer matter or energy from one point to another. And this last one is more under extrasensory perception, but it's basically a sixth sense type deal. And this one is clairvoyance, which is the ability to see things that are happening far away and locate objects, places, people using a sixth sense. Okay, that was a lot, and I had to leave out quite a few because maybe I'll do a podcast episode on each one day. Maybe. Don't hold your breath, please. There is so much to cover. But basically, the type of psychic ability that remote viewing psychics utilized was the extrasensory perception of clairvoyance. So basically, they were able to sense locations whether there were enemy bases or battlefields, and they were able to locate the amount of people, the types of weapons, the layouts, without ever having to physically go there, which would be really, really useful in a war, because you won't have to send people in to spy. You could just have your psychic sit in a room safely back home and tell you what's going on. I understand why the CIA would think, this is interesting. So, mild sidebar, but have you all seen Psych? The detective show where he wasn't actually psychic, he just had really, really good powers of perception. Like he could analyze his surroundings really well and fill in the gaps of knowledge with the information that he was able to deduce using his insane powers of observation. So my idea of what these psychics were is that maybe they just did that. And they were just really, really, really good at what they did for those of them that did have a lot of positive results. But that's just my theory. Hopefully throughout the episode we get more solid answers. So I'm sure we all know psychics were definitely a huge deal before the government decided to utilize them during the Cold War. Throughout history, people with various psychic gifts have popped up in the spotlight repeatedly, whether it is in a religious or a secular context. In more recent history, there has also been a wave of people that try to discredit psychics, one of which is the master of illusion himself, the great Houdini. So Houdini himself made it a personal mission that after he was defrauded by a psychic that claimed to be communicating with his mother, he set out to make sure that no one was going to be defrauded like that again. He would actually show up to psychic shows and call them out for the tricks that they use to deceive the audience. He even went so far as to publish articles and give speeches that fake mediums were, misleading people. And he testified in Congress to support legislation to criminalize fortune telling. That's how much he hated it. Enough about debunking psychics, though. While many people are skeptical about the legitimacy of psychics, the CIA definitely saw enough in them to not only start Project Stargate, but they even revisited the idea in the 90s. So what type of desperate conditions did the Cold War create that caused the literal Central Intelligence Agency to think they had no better options than utilizing psychics? Well, I'm not going to teach you history, but I will need to set the stage. So even though we're talking about the United States and the Soviet Union and the Cold War, we have to talk about what came before them: World War II and Nazi Germany. It feels like a lot of things go back to that event in our modern world. But anyway, the Germans had some crazy ideas back in the 30s and 40s. So they had racial purity of the Aryan people, world ice theory, the Holy Grail of Christianity. There was a lot. So in the early days of the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler and his inner circle were obsessed with finding the Holy Grail. They believed the Grail would grant them supernatural powers that would help them win the war. So they turned to Otto Rahn to help them find it. Rahn was a German archaeologist who studied the Grail legend extensively. He was also a member of the Nazi Party, and he was willing to do whatever it took to help his country win the war. So the Nazis' ideology claimed that they were racially and spiritually superior to everyone else. Furthermore, they believed that the Aryan race was a direct descendant of the ancient gods and destined to rule the world. Their theories were based on Nordic mythology, paganism, and occult beliefs. The Third Reich believed that magical artifacts existed and were determined to find them. So they actually created a whole branch of operations that were tasked specifically with finding these artifacts. Naturally, none of these actually panned out, and in 1945, with the Nazi regime defeated, members of an elite U.S. scientific intelligence initiative called Operation Alsos, they made their way to Berlin to scoop up as much intel as possible on German military projects. In the bombed-out remains of a villa in an affluent neighborhood in southwestern Berlin, they uncovered a cache of documents and artifacts that were actually part of the Ahnenerbe, which is Heinrich Himmler's science organization, and it was really well funded. So the funny thing is, in the race to Berlin, both the Allies and the Soviets uncovered this information. So, going into the 50s, it was not just a nuclear arms race that was about to begin, but a psychic one as well. So, the United States supernatural research actually took off in the 1950s, when it set about countering Soviet mind control. So this was thought to be a legitimate concern at the time, and it was based, at least partially, on Nazi research uncovered at Ahnenerbe. So both the US and the Soviet Union relied on the caches of Nazi research they discovered, some of which were detailed experiments conducted at concentration camps where Nazi scientists pushed human physiology to extremes while they monitored the results. I'm not even going to describe some of these experiments, as this is horrifying and it's probably not something that YouTube would let me leave up. But for anyone listening, feel free to look it up. But just a heads up, there is a ton of torture. So there was a decorated World War II hero by the name of Nina Kulagina, who was the Soviet Union's most famous psychic. She was rumored to have the ability to stop an animal's beating heart using psychokinesis, which we talked about earlier, and it's the supposed ability to affect physical matter with the mind. So Nina was a housewife and former Red Army Tank Regiment member, and in March of 1970, she underwent monitoring for psychic abilities at Utomsky Military Institute in Leningrad, Russia. As part of her observation, she was to stop a frog's heart that was removed and placed in a solution that was supposed to keep it beating for up to an hour, while scientists monitored the amount of beats per minute of this frog heart. So Kulagina, she actually stopped the frog's heart in 7 minutes after spending 20 minutes preparing mentally to do it. Her next test was to accelerate the heart rate of a physician. So they were both hooked up to EKG machines, but the test was called off when the physician's heart rate actually accelerated to a dangerous level. So it's important to note that Kulagina was accused of being a fraud who had helped with rigging all of her psychic feats. And a Russian newspaper, Pravda, actually went so far as to call her a fraud. Like a newspaper of Russia was like, nope, she was a fraud. But of course, once news of this test made it to the US, the Department of Defense, it got their attention. The interesting thing about the Soviets deciding to utilize psychic ability, though, is that they saw mysticism in the same way they saw religion. They thought of it as an opiate of the masses, according to Marxist ideology. So they had outlawed everything deemed paranormal, up until the point of starting to realize that maybe it could be useful against their enemies. So in order to pursue anything paranormal, however, they did spend the time rephrasing anything involving extrasensory perception to seem a lot more scientific. And they framed psychokinesis as non-ionizing electromagnetic emission from humans. They spent the 1960s studying the energy flows surrounding human beings and had such high hopes for it that one doctor claimed that the discovery of the power behind ESP would be just as impactful as the discovery of atomic energy. So with all of the attention that the Soviet programs were getting, especially after the 1962 discovery of a strong electromagnetic signal aimed at the US Embassy in Moscow that was actually discovered, the US decided to also start their own studies. But anyway, the psychics. So this fear of Soviet mind control was reinforced by videos of American prisoners of war reciting communist propaganda. And at the time, to the American people, that was terrifying. So of course, we look back now and we think, hey, that's ridiculous. You can't just brainwash someone. But it certainly looked that way when you watch these old black and white images of those prisoners of war. And this fear is, of course, what led us to another topic, MK Ultra, which is a beast of a topic that we will have to address in a full episode in the future. But I will sum it up really quickly here. The CIA-backed mind control program MK Ultra officially started in 1953. It ran well into the 1960s, and it involved dosing American citizens with biological and chemical agents like LSD or acid, often without the individual's knowledge, which I guess that's fine. But anyway, it's just the CIA doing CIA stuff. So both the Soviet Union and the US government pointed to the others' research into mind control, counter mind control, and psychic phenomena in general as just justification for their research. Like, he's doing it, so I need to do it. You know what I'm saying? So with each crazy new rumor, some based on actual experiments, others little more than disinformation campaigns, the psychic arms race picked up speed. And so, skipping forward a few years, that brings us to Project Stargate, which is the point of this whole episode. This project was launched in 1978 as a direct response to the before-mentioned Soviet psychic energy research. The Stargate program focused primarily on remote viewing, which means they studied the use of psychic powers to see really faraway places. It was a way to essentially spy on enemy locations before drones and other tech like that were developed. So the way that this worked is the coordinates of a Soviet military base were given to an individual, or a team was sent to that location to act as like a conduit for the remote viewer. And that viewer would then describe exactly what they saw at that location. The interesting thing is that there were sometimes very accurate results and descriptions that were given by these psychics. Russell Targ and Uri Geller were two of these psychics. And there was essentially an entire team of psychics that were based at the Stanford Research Institute. These psychics would sit in their offices, close their eyes, breathe deeply, and then they would be able to name the location of Soviet missiles. The interesting part, though, is that they were occasionally right. And I don't know if this is because of random chance, because if you do something enough, eventually you're gonna get the outcome that you want. I don't know. So Targ and Geller believed that while what they were doing was harmless, their Soviet counterparts were actively trying to cause harm to others. They believed that the Soviet attempts at mind control were way more dangerous, as it was said that they had a replica of the Oval Office that was filled with psychics in there 24/7 that were trying to mess with the thoughts of the President of the United States. It was also reported that one lab in Kharkov was shut down as the scientists themselves rejected some of the morally questionable experiments. However, it was believed that another more secret lab was set up in its place, and this is where death row prisoners of the KGB were bombarded with pulsing magnetic fields to see if they would become clairvoyant. So many years later, Dr. Bryukhanov claimed that with his project, they were able to get animals the ability to see through walls, but their brains could not cope with the constant magnetic fields and disintegrated. The death row prisoners that they were experimenting on were reported to have faced the same fate. So everything that Stargate set out to do was to simply research anything that their enemies were potentially looking into, just in case it had some viability. And as it says so in all the documents published on CIA.gov, this was their main goal. Essentially, if the Soviets had the ability to remote view or use mind control in any form, they wanted to be able to counter it, as it would cause drastic losses for the American military. It was published in a 1981 issue of The Investigator that the U.S. Navy was the first armed service to look into psychics in 1952, since they were hoping that it would help them locate Soviet submarines. Then in 1961, because of the growing concerns of paranormal phenomenon, the CIA actually commissioned a parapsychology lab at Oxford to look into ESP. And the study came back showing that ESP was demonstrated, but not understood or controllable, so they did not pursue it. However, in the 1970s, concerns that the US was losing the race of ESP and clairvoyance, along with the scientific community and trusted scientific journals such as Nature and Science, shining a lot more light on ESP abilities, this actually led the US to revisit the pursuit of remote viewing and to take it a little bit more seriously, especially when Targ was able to convince them that remote viewing might actually be a viable intel collection tool. So a lot of higher-ups whose names were redacted, I'm not even joking, they were full-on blacked out in the document, they had a lot of back and forths over the project. One man said that parapsychology was not rooted in any fact and lacked sustained support since it has no explanation, unusual or otherwise. And then he was countered by the Chief of Special Projects for the Defense Intelligence Agency, who happened to be an aeronautical engineer. And this guy said that not all science can be explained in advance by theory. He says that for over 15 years, he's gotten strong correlations, and they were really, really striking and well beyond chance. So it's not predictable, but it is predictable on the human side when looking at psychological factors. He says that a lack of direct and easy answers doesn't invalidate the basic phenomenon. So I include these arguments just because I'm sure whether you're a skeptic or a believer, they encompass what we more than likely feel. So what did the US government really do and research? I literally read 97 pages of a CIA document to get this for you guys, so appreciate me, okay? Thanks. So the chapter on US attitudes starts off by saying, remote viewing won't be accepted by Americans without irrefutable proof. It then goes on to describe the exact study that Targ did at Stanford. Basically, a remote viewer was put in a windowless lab, and an SRI researcher who acted as a conduit for the viewer retrieved one of 60 target cards from a locked safe and departed from a location dictated on that target card. So these cards were then numbered 1 to 60, and they were selected by the conduit using a random number function, which means that the target selected was not known by the interviewer or the remote viewer. So each target site was within a 30-minute driving time from the institute, and once the viewing time arrived, the remote viewer was asked to draw what he envisioned at the target site, and verbal descriptions were recorded. The person at the site, they just had to pay attention to what they saw at the site, and once they were together, they compiled all of the data and then returned to the site to discuss the tests. So once 6 of these tests were done, they were assigned to judges who had to review the data and judge whether there was a success rating for each experiment based on the scoring criteria that they worked out. Basically, judges just had to determine which data packages matched which data site, and they were able to do so in about half of these cases, which for psychic research, that's an amazing result. A follow-up study looked at the resolution of remote viewing. They actually assessed the ability of a remote viewer to identify an item concealed in a 35mm film canister carried by a target person. So a target person chose one of 10 random vials, and then they went to a location and remained there for 10 minutes. Then they returned to the lab where the viewer, target, and interviewer all learned the contents of the canister for the first time. Again, a judge evaluated the results. So, in addition to short-range experiments, Puthoff and Tarr conducted long-distance experiments as well with equally significant results. So in 1973, two American psychics projected their minds over long distances, and they actually accurately described secret military installations in the Ural Mountains, as well as in China. The accuracy of these readings were verified by agents that were placed in these countries. So with all of these so far positive results, why did the CIA not pursue it further? Well, that can be found in the internal tension between believers in parapsychology and the non-believers. So the U.S. Army Research Institute, or ARI, contracted the National Research Council, the NRC, to review the human performance, but the way it was done was seen as biased by certain individuals. So the ARI hired a civilian Army psychologist and the former HR director of the Pentagon's Advanced Research Projects Agency. But no one that they hired to look into it actually had any background in parapsychology. So this led a lot of people to be upset over the fact that the analysis failed to deliver an objective and biased assessment of the test. So the Parapsychology Association uncovered many erroneous and incomplete data sets in the NRC's report. However, this report did confirm that the military was concerned about Soviet research into parapsychology and showed that the fear of the Soviet Union beating the US at something led to more military money spent on parapsychology than it otherwise would have been. Basically, they were saying that if they were not afraid of the Soviets, they would not be spending money on this project, and some people thought that they were wasting a lot of money on this project. But the people that they hired to do all of that had no background on parapsychology, so obviously people were upset. So with all of these studies and fears, by the 1980s, there was far more outward support than before. Instead of short bursts of support and interest, things evolved into a steady flow of interest. In fact, in 1981, remote viewers were used to aid in the hunt for General James L. Dozier, who was abducted in Verona by Italian terrorists. The remote viewing was unsuccessful, and U.S. agencies were frustrated with the lack of results from psychics in this instance. But it did show that there was at least a willingness to try it out. In 1984, even the Washington Post's Jack Anderson, who was a well-known skeptic, wrote, quote, "But there are legitimate lab projects that may eventually unlock the mysteries of the human mind. One of the most promising is the testing of remote viewing." So now that we have covered the studies that were done and the general reception of the military's research into parapsychology, we actually have to look at the political and military applications of the research that was done and of remote viewing as a whole. So there were a lot of very optimistic goals for remote viewing, like getting rid of the ground spies and utilizing remote viewers in order to gather intel and read the minds of politicians in meetings around the globe. Optimists hoped that it would revolutionize the way we spied on other countries, and it also give us a lot more control in how we manipulate other countries. The first actual intelligence collection operation conducted by the CIA utilized ex-police commissioner and vice mayor of Burbank, Pat Price, so Burbank, California. So Pat Price is today still known as Stanford Research Institute's most successful remote viewer. Prior to using him for this operation, he was tested by the CIA, and Price was so specific that he was able to give lists of file folders locked in file cabinets at a facility 135 miles away. And he was exactly right about all of it. So in 1974, Price was used to spy on a Soviet research and development facility. He was told to focus on a location that had a tall crane and 4 structures that looked like oil well derricks. He was given the coordinates and a world map with the approximate location of the facility, but not told what he was supposed to see. Price's data included a description of the crane, but left out the oil derricks. And when he was asked why, he said it was because they were not there anymore. So they decided, okay, we'll go check this, we'll see what's up with the oil derricks. When they checked it, the derricks were being disassembled, but technically they were still visible. The general consensus of this was that while Price was able to get some good information, a lot of good info was mixed in with bad or incomplete information, and so it was unusable. In addition, there were no control experiments to compare the data to, so they just credited the good information to, a lucky guess, because if you're guessing about a location out there, like, odds are they might have a crane. I don't know. After this attempt, a theoretical physicist was tasked to review the information. Again, they were really thorough about peer review, and he concluded that there was a large body of reliable experimental evidence in favor of ESP. So again, they were like, hey, Price, let's test you. He had to remotely view the code rooms within 2 foreign embassies. He was shown photos of the exterior of the embassies and given geographical coordinates. He was able to give a lot of information about the doors, the stairs, the fireplaces, but there was also a lot of vague and incorrect data included again. However, it was seen by the CIA as accurate enough to keep the tests and the program going. So, Price's final test before he died involved viewing a Libyan training facility. His report gave map-like drawings and also described an underwater training facility. The information was verified, and the underwater facility was also found in another agent's report. See, the unfortunate thing, though, is even with all of this progress being made, Price ended up dying in 1975, and since then there have been no further CIA-sponsored tests on remote viewing as an intelligence tool. After this, the CIA, they ended up scaling down a ton of their paranormal research due to the scrutiny that they were already receiving from involvement in the Watergate scandal. Like, this whole thing is just really bad timing, because maybe they might have been onto something, but yeah, the scandal. So all in all, as we watch this whole thing evolve over time, there was so much back and forth between politicians and agencies over whether it was worth pursuing, and even when results were found, skepticism held them back from digging further. And Price was making a ton of headway, but then his death, along with the unfortunate timing of Watergate, held them back from pursuing anything further. So the CIA ended the program in 1977, and it was then turned over to the Defense Intelligence Agency, where more modest testing was done with remote viewing with the hopes of perfecting it to the point of application. So in the mid-90s, the Defense Intelligence Agency actually gave the program back to the CIA, who decided to make another attempt at remote viewing. And if you want to read about it, just Google an evaluation of remote viewing. It'll pop right up. It is a 183-page document that essentially concludes the exact same thing that was concluded in the 70s. There was enough accurate remote viewing experiences to defy random chance, but the phenomenon was too unreliable, inconsistent, and sporadic to be useful for intelligence purposes. And due to this, they didn't restore the program. But yeah, guys, that is the end of it. The program was rocky from the start. I can't help but imagine what may have come from it if we kept going with our research. But it really is, was it random chance? Were they educated guesses? Because if you look at an embassy, surely there would be fireplaces and staircases. But he knew locations. I don't know. It just makes me wonder, you know? But that is all I have for you. Hopefully one day in the future, maybe we'll have more clarity on remote viewing and psychokinesis as a whole. Thank you guys for listening to this episode. I know it was extra long. My voice is gone. I'm not used to talking this much for this long. I learned a lot on this, and I think it was fascinating. And if you guys have any more suggestions on what you'd like to see, let me know. Thank you, and bye.